Deep beneath Westminster Abbey lies a coffin no one dares to open. It belonged to the most powerful woman England had ever seen, a queen who ruled without a king, and whose body was meant to remain untouched forever. But when they opened it centuries later, what they found inside was not human anymore. A corpse that hissed, a face that melted, a heart that turned to stone. This wasn't just a royal burial. This was a biological catastrophe sealed in lead. Why did her body refuse to rot? What exploded beneath the abbey's floor? And what did the men who uncovered her never dare put into writing? They called her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. But what she became after death was something monstrous. This is the story the monarchy will never tell you. And the deeper we go, the harder it is to look away. Stay with us, because at the very end of this video you'll discover the one thing they pulled from her coffin that still pulses with fear to this day. There are tombs that exist to be remembered, and there are tombs that exist to be forgotten. Deep beneath the marble floors of Westminster Abbey, in a vault pressed under centuries of stone and silence, there lies such a tomb, one that, for over 300 years, remained untouched by sunlight, untroubled by reverence. It was not meant to be opened, not truly, not by human hands, not by curious minds. It was designed for secrecy, a monument to power that dared not be examined too closely. The name carved into its surface belonged to a monarch who had once ruled with brilliance, fire, and myth. A queen who had turned her body into a symbol of divine authority and her silence into a weapon of control. Her reign spanned nearly half a century, and by the time she left the world, her legend had already sealed her as more than woman, less than mortal. Her name was Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, Supreme Governor of Church and Crown, a woman draped in white lead and red silk, who lived not merely to rule, but to construct an image so perfect, so unchanging, that even time itself would hesitate to touch her. And yet time is never merciful. It corrodes everything, even legends, especially legends. When the lead-lined coffin of Elizabeth I was finally opened in the 19th century, under flickering lanterns and the thin justifications of science and preservation, what was found inside that tomb was not a relic of divine rule. It was a warning, a grotesque, chemical catastrophe, a body that had resisted decay for decades, only to give in violently beneath its false immortality. Skin turned to black parchment, hair thin and brittle as burned linen, a face collapsed inward, swallowed by its own silence, and at the center, an organ, once the seat of a woman's breath, her voice, her will, transformed into a hardened stone of deep grey poison. Her heart, sealed like a secret, fused by alchemy and corruption. But before that horror, before that dreadful unveiling, there was the illusion, an illusion born in life and preserved in death. Elizabeth did not enter history quietly. She left claw marks in the narrative, fingerprints on the very image of monarchy itself. She understood the danger of being seen as a woman in power, and so she crafted an identity that made her more than a woman. She made herself into myth. Her face became a mask, carefully painted, powdered, protected. Her clothes, a fortress of lace and steel. Her words, calculated, precise, never wasted. Every public appearance was theatre, every portrait, prophecy. To the people, she was England itself, and yet within her own bones, she was dissolving. In her final days, she refused rest, refused the bed, refused to lie down. As though the moment her spine met linen, the kingdom would shatter. She stood 4 hours, pacing her chambers in shadow. Her courtiers begged her to eat, to sleep, to speak. She did none of those things. She stared ahead, unmoving, haunted by something only she could see. A face, perhaps, from the mirror, a voice from the corridor, a silence growing beneath her ribs. And when at last, she allowed herself to be carried to the cushions, it was too late. The Queen had fallen, but the myth that needed to be preserved. Her death was not declared with sorrow. It was whispered with urgency. Her body was taken, shrouded, guarded, not by reverence, but by fear. Fear that the symbol might unravel. What happens when the symbol dies? They tried to embalm her, to stop what was already beginning, but her body resisted. The years of paint and powder, of controlled starvation and theatrical appearances, had left her flesh fragile, foreign. The surgeons, if we can call them that, opened her, and what they found was not grace, it was collapse. Her inner organs, softened by time and toxins, refused the rituals of preservation. Her stomach leaked, her lungs hissed, her blood had already begun to pull away from her veins. And her face, oh her face, the one weapon she had always used, the mask of power, the holy image printed on medals, prayer books, and cathedral windows, had collapsed. The facial muscles, once held taut by expression, had loosened in death. The cheeks caved in, the lips retracted, the skin tore at the temples. There are no surviving sketches of this moment, and for good reason. What was seen beneath the cosmetic myth could not be shown, because it revealed not a queen, but a body, not a goddess, but a woman. This terrified them more than anything. They reassembled her with wax and cloth. They stuffed and shaped and stitched her into an acceptable version of herself, a sculpture of memory, not a corpse, but a performance. By the time her coffin was sealed, the thing inside it was not Elizabeth. It was an illusion of her final wish, never to be seen as she really was. And thus, the vault was closed. For centuries, that lead tomb remained intact, silent, revered above, forgotten below. The generations changed. Monarchs came and went. Wars raged and fell quiet. The abbey itself cracked and settled. But below, she waited. The monarch who refused decay. Also they believed. In truth, something else was happening. Quietly, viciously, inevitable. The lead casing, chosen for its durability, had trapped not just her remains, but every ounce of chemical instability within her. The embalmer's efforts, the wax, the oils, the metals, the organic tissue, all fused into a sealed crucible, and within that crucible, transformation. A second death, slower, angrier, uglier. When the vault was finally opened, it was not reverence that rose, it was stench. It was a kind of vengeance. Her body had become unrecognizable, her flesh no longer flesh, her bones no longer clean. The once sovereign body of Elizabeth had become a chemical phantom, a grotesque blend of royal ambition and organic collapse. And as the coffin lid was lifted, those present were met not with silence, but with something far worse. The coffin made a sound, a long, low hiss, not breath, not voice, but pressure, the sound of centuries escaping. One attendant fainted, another reported a presence in the air, as if the room itself recoiled from what it now contained. And in the center of it all, beneath the layers of ruined cloth and collapsed ritual, lay the heart, darkened, hardened, impossibly preserved, not through divine will, but through some unknown mixture of oils, metals, and what could only be described as alchemy. The heart had not rotted, it had not softened, it had turned to stone, smooth and natural, and slightly luminous in the lantern light, a relic of power, transformed by secrecy and time into something other. And so we ask, what happens when a monarch dies, and her myth continues to mutate inside her own tomb? What happens when silence ferments? This is not the story of a queen who ruled. This is the story of a body that refused to rest. She had ruled longer than anyone thought she would, outlived her enemies, outmaneuvered her allies, even her own body. She had kept at bay, maintained not with health but with vigilance. But time, like power, is not something that can be bargained with. In her final days, Elizabeth ceased to speak of governance. She ceased to speak of almost anything at all. Her chambers, once bright with foreign silks and sharp with the scent of orange oil and white lead, became darkened tombs of airless waiting. The windows were shuttered, the fires dimmed, courtiers hovered in distant rooms like reluctant moths, unsure whether to intrude or flee. Inside, the queen moved like a ghost in her own body. She no longer allowed herself to sit, to lie down. She believed would be to surrender, not just to rest, but to death itself. And so she stood, hour after hour, night after night, wrapped in furs and velvet. She stood in silence, rigid, unspeaking, unmoving, as time passed around her. The clocks ticking, once a symbol of precision and rule, became unbearable. The hands of time now mocked her with every movement. Sleep would not come. Food became meaningless. Her body, so long a symbol of divine detachment, now betrayed her in ways she could no longer deny. Her fingers trembled, her legs swelled, her breath thinned and crackled. Every movement brought discomfort, but still, she stood. She refused a physician. She refused a priest. She refused her bed. It was said she muttered under her breath during these long vigils, not prayers, but memories, names, faces. She spoke to no one, but sometimes her eyes would move to a shadow in the corner and stay there, as if watching something or someone slowly step closer. Some believed she was already hallucinating. Others whispered that she knew precisely what she was seeing and would not tell, because Elizabeth had always known to be mortal, visibly mortal, was to lose control. And so even at the edge of the void, she kept the theatre going. She continued to wear her jewels. She applied the white mask to her skin even as it cracked and blistered underneath. The red dots at her temples, the cochineal on her lips, ritual applied with trembling hands. Her image mattered more than her comfort. To falter was to die, and she intended to die only on her own terms. But her body had other plans. The shaking grew worse. The light in her eyes flickered. The silence around her turned suffocating. And finally, with no ceremony, no warning, the woman who had refused to lie down collapsed. The impact was not loud. The sound was small. A shift of weight, the crack of bone beneath a fall, the soft clatter of a ring striking the stone floor. A lady in waiting found her. There was no scream, only a gasp, not from the queen, but from the girl, who saw the monarch not as a figurehead now, but as something terrifyingly human. Her face, half covered in flaking paint, the other half raw and spotted with burst vessels, stared upward with eyes open wide. Not lifeless, not yet, but nearly. A bed was brought. It was the first time Elizabeth touched one in days, and it would be the last. Even in her final hours, the mask held, she allowed only a few to approach, those who had been with her the longest, and even they were kept at distance. Her breath came shallow and irregular, and no one dared speak of what came next, because they all understood her death was not just an ending, it was a danger. There was no named successor, no public announcement, only the heavy knowledge that once her breath stopped, the entire country would need to reorient, and quickly. So they waited, and she floated. Some said her eyes never fully closed, that they twitched, moved, followed the flickering of candles, as if still watching, still judging. Her pulse grew thin. She muttered once, something incomprehensible, a sound between a word and a warning, and then nothing. The body of the most powerful woman England had ever known lay motionless, her skin no longer warm, her muscles slack, but no one moved, not immediately, because there was a moment, long, cold, and paralyzing, where no one in the room believed it had truly happened. They waited for the eyelids to snap open, for the voice to rise, for the monarch to reassert herself. But she didn't. She was gone, and what was left behind was not a woman. It was a problem. No one knew what to say. When the queen finally lay still, the silence that had filled her chambers did not lift. It thickened. Her ladies froze. The courtiers exchanged glances, each waiting for the other to move first. To touch the body of the Virgin Queen was not just an act of loyalty, it was a decision of political consequence. And now that she was no longer breathing, what she had left behind was not only a corpse, it was a vessel of instability. She had died without clear succession, without public farewell, and more importantly, without allowing her legend to fully settle into stone. Her body had been a symbol, a weapon, a mask, and now it had to be hidden, fast. The command came quietly, passed like a whisper, from one hallway to the next. Prepare her, seal her, let no one see the truth. A physician, aged, reluctant, was summoned, and with him, a pair of assistants. They entered her chamber not as doctors, But as men tasked with disguising reality, the body was pale and rigid. The expression on the Queen's face twisted between effort and refusal. Her lips had retracted, her teeth now partially visible. One eye had not fully closed. The room stank of old perfume and the iron tang of failing flesh. They removed her jewelry first, cautiously, reverently. Rings slipped from her swollen fingers. Her neck bore bruises from where pearls had pressed too tightly in her final days. Her dress, once a cathedral of velvet and embroidery, was peeled away like a curtain, hiding a decaying altar. What they found underneath was not regal. Her torso was sunken, her stomach distended, her skin yellowing and stretched tight over bones. The surgeon hesitated. He had preserved noble bodies before, dukes, consorts, children, but none like this. Not a queen of such scale, such legend. There was no manual for this kind of body, because this body was not supposed to be real, but now it was real, human. Falling apart, they began the incision. The abdomen was sliced open, and at once, a scent filled the chamber so foul and thick that one assistant staggered backward and nearly collapsed. The organs, so long poisoned by cosmetics, stimulants, restrictive eating, and ceremonial medicines, had fermented. The intestines had already begun to liquefy. The stomach lining was mottled and brittle. The liver had fused to the surrounding cavity. This was not a body prepared to meet eternity. This was a body in rebellion. Her lungs hissed when touched, gases releasing from the tissues as if exhaling secrets. The heart, once steady and regal beneath gold and lace, had shriveled, grown fibrous, oddly dense. It was removed with difficulty and set aside in a pewter vessel lined with coarse salts and herbs. They scraped the inside of her skull, emptied her eyes, drained her veins. Her intestines were packed with linen and oils. Her cavities were filled with waxed wool soaked in camphor, benzoin, and myrrh. A mask was formed from beeswax and laid across her face to restore symmetry, to replace what had collapsed. But it was never quite right. The mouth remained twisted, the skin peeled, again and again, refusing the preservatives. They coated her fingers in powdered bone and resin to conceal the signs of bloating. They sewed her closed with black thread, and when they finished, they stepped back and stared. What lay on the table was not Elizabeth, not the woman who had once banished armies with a gesture, who had stood upon cliffs and declared herself married to her kingdom. What lay there was an imitation, a sculpture made of sorrow and urgency, a monument to what the world could no longer allow itself to see. They dressed her again, smoothing the gown, resetting the jewels, placing the stiffened hands across the abdomen. The final portrait would be closed casket. Her true form, now sealed within wax and prayer, would be lowered not into silence, but into strategy, because even in death, Elizabeth was political, and her burial would be a theatre, no less choreographed than her coronation. The decision was made swiftly. She would lie in state, briefly. The display would be carefully managed. The body would not be too near. The people would see what they needed to see, not what remained, but what once was. The day before the viewing, her coffin was carried into the painted chamber. The lead line shell had been sealed with wax and iron, layered to ensure no scent, no truth, could escape. A small opening was allowed only for a moment, enough for courtiers to confirm the placement of her likeness, not her face, her likeness, a wax effigy, placed atop the coffin, clothed in royal robes, adorned with her favorite scepter and orb. This figure, cold, unmoving, perfect, was the new queen. The crowd gathered. They came not to mourn, but to witness, to see what the virgin queen had become. They filed past in silence. Some wept, others bowed. No one spoke of the smell, not yet. The wax held, the seal held, but time pressed forward, and inside the coffin, something was waking. The materials placed within her, the oils, the soaked cloths, the scented pastes, had begun to interact with her remains. Chemical reactions surged. The oils congealed, the linen fermented, the organs, partially removed, poorly preserved, began to exude gases. The lead, while durable, was unforgiving. It trapped everything. The coffin, now sealed tight, became an alchemical cauldron. By the time her funeral procession began, the heat from the spring air had started its silent work. The carriage was wrapped in black velvet. Horses moved slowly. The people lined the streets, watching, cheering, crying. They did not know what the guards knew, that the coffin was changing. Inside, pressure had begun to build. Small cracks formed in the resin lining. The silk wrappings inside the casket became damp, then slick, then alive with slow, invisible colonies of rot. At the abbey, the coffin was received with solemn hymns and great echoing bell tolls. Bishops stood in rows of crimson and gold. Nobles wept on cue. The body of the queen was lowered into the tomb, into a vault carved not just from stone, but from denial. No one questioned the speed of the burial. No one asked to see her again. The vault was sealed with ceremony. Prayers were spoken. Candles were left to burn down into wax puddles. The doors closed, and still, inside, it continued. In the darkness of her tomb, beneath the stone, beneath the abbey itself, her remains festered. What could not be seen could not be controlled, and what could not be controlled began to mutate. The heart, once removed and treated, had resisted all attempts to soften it. Instead of dissolving, it hardened. What was once living tissue became a mass, dense, waxy, and inexplicably intact. The lungs, poorly drained, filled again with fluid, sealed within the saturated wool. The embalming mixtures poured. Metallic salts melted into her bloodstream. The wax mask slipped, but no one knew. Above her, the abbey thrived. Monarchs were crowned, hymns were sung. Visitors passed over her grave without knowing the truth, that beneath the stone, the queen they had worshipped was still transforming, not into memory, but into something else, a relic not of reverence, but of warning. Beneath Westminster Abbey, the air does not move. The vaults, carved in ancient patterns and pressed with layers of stone and royal ambition, are not designed for breath. They are designed for permanence. They do not change. They do not release. They only absorb. And for centuries, that is exactly what they did. The tomb of Elizabeth I, sealed in layers of silence and symbolism, remained untouched. Visitors passed above, oblivious. Historians speculated. The church catalogued its burial plans, noting only what had to be known. But inside, the queen was still unraveling. What no one anticipated, or chose to ignore, was that the very materials used to preserve her were also destroying her. The oils and unguents, soaked into every fold of cloth, reacted with the linen. The wax, carefully layered to stabilize her face, began to seep into her mouth and eyes as heat fluctuated year by year. Her hair, infused with stiffening agents, disintegrated into tar. Her skin, preserved in parts and neglected in others, developed chemical burns from within. And most ominously, the heart, the same organ removed and sealed in its separate vessel, began to darken further, harden further, until it resembled something almost geological, a mineral, a token, a thing no longer human. And yet the tomb was undisturbed. Her name remained revered. Her story was repeated in books and sermons and ceremonies, but truth rotted beneath them. It wasn't until the 19th century that something shifted. The Victorians, with their morbid curiosity and obsession with death, began to probe at the sealed narratives of the past. Tombs were opened, bones were studied, crowns were catalogued and measured, some under the banner of science, others under the hunger for macabre history. And so, in time, they came forward, not publicly, not with trumpet or fanfare, but quietly. A committee, a team, scholars and churchmen with lanterns and gloves. They descended into the vault, opened the stone, and breathed in what the past had tried to forget. They expected silence. Instead, they met pressure. The coffin had become its own sealed ecosystem. Inside, gases had continued to accumulate, generated by decades of bacterial alchemy. The second the lid cracked, the vault exhaled, slowly at first, then with a low hiss, not unlike breath, but deeper, thicker, more deliberate. The scent hit like a hand, not just rot, but metal, mildew, wax, and something else. Old violence. The body had not held. The wax mask had melted into the jaw. The linens had soaked through with black, tar-like fluid. The hands, once folded gently across her stomach, were now bloated, twisted. One ring had fused to the skin. Another had cracked and corroded into the bone. Her ribs were visible. Her face, no longer a face. And at the center, the heart is still intact, still solid, resting in its separate vessel, dark and gleaming like obsidian. It had not decomposed. It had condensed. One of the attendants reached to touch it. He stopped. Something in the back of the mind recoils from what should not be. Not because it is monstrous, but because it is unnatural. This was not preservation. It was transformation. The chemicals used on her had not simply delayed decay. They had converted her into something between organic and artifact. The notes taken were fragmented. Some scholars denied what was seen. Others tried to explain it away, as error, as superstition, as overstatement. But those present did not forget. A few recorded dreams. One confessed visions in the days that followed. The stench clung to their clothes for weeks, and the body. They did not touch it again. They resealed the coffin. They closed the vault. The records were filed with caution, and eventually ignored, because no one wanted to face what that tomb had truly become. Not a resting place, but a crucible, the perfect symbol. A queen who had turned herself into legend, now reduced to an unstable mass of wax, bone, poison, and cloth. Unseeing, unchanging, unreleasing, and yet not at peace. Her body was sealed again. The lead coffin closed, the vault rebricked, the records tucked into shelves few would ever open. But something had changed. The men who entered the tomb did not leave as they arrived. What they saw was not just rot, it was resistance. The myth had decomposed, and the body had rebelled. Elizabeth's legend had been built on perfection. The perfect queen, the perfect virgin, the perfect image of power without flaw. But in death, that perfection turned on itself. No longer frozen in portraits or controlled by chamberlains. The queen's body told its own story. And that story was not holy. It was not noble. It was not silent. It was slow and hot and unstable. It was chemical, bacterial, fluid, a kind of silent vengeance, not from a soul, but from matter. The same matter that had once been powdered, painted, perfumed, now tore itself apart in a sealed box of imperial denial. Her body had become a warning, not only to those who had embalmed her, not only to those who uncovered her, but to all who still believed power could outlive biology. Because there was a truth, deep in that coffin, deeper than any Latin inscription on her tombstone. No amount of control can protect the body from being body. Elizabeth had tried. For decades, she sculpted herself into something unhuman. She was not a wife, not a mother, not flesh. She wore a mask, not metaphorically, but literally. Her makeup was theatre, her image a weapon. And it worked, for a time, until the paint cracked, until the skin gave way, until the breath stopped, and her body, finally ungoverned, answered none of her commands. This is the paradox of sovereignty. It demands divinity from what is only ever mortal, and no monarch in English history played that contradiction more brilliantly than Elizabeth. She stood for unity, for stability, for empire, but in the end, she was just meat and memory. Her tomb became proof, not of her greatness, but of her limits. The irony could not be more exact. She, who denied all heirs, produced in death the most grotesque legacy of all. A body transformed into toxic matter, a queen whose silence had once ruled nations, now fizzed beneath the abbey like a cursed reliquary. It is said that monarchs live on through monuments, through coins, cathedrals, and bloodlines. But Elizabeth's true monument is not stone. It is what happened inside her coffin, the slow destruction of a myth, not by time, but by its own lies. Because embalming does not preserve, it only delays the truth. And in Elizabeth's case, that truth was profound. Her body, once symbolic, sacred, feared, became what she had always feared it would be: a thing, an object, a liability, one that had to be hidden, managed, covered, until even those who revered her recoiled. And yet, the memory of her remains, not the real her, not the rot, not the hiss, not the shriveled hands or fossilized heart. No, the world remembers the mask, the portraits, the voice that never cracked. But under Westminster, something else remembers, something else sits, expands, shifts with temperature, breathes in vapors from long dead herbs and bleeds through silk that no longer smells of perfume. What lies in that tomb is not a queen, it is a contradiction, a riddle made of ruin, a final act that will never be seen, but will always be felt, because deep down, even now, we know she's not at rest, and she never wanted to be. There is a kind of haunting that leaves no footsteps, no cold spots, no flickering lights, only silence, shaped like memory. And Elizabeth haunts in this way, not as a ghost with chains and warnings, but as something stranger, a silence that speaks, a myth that breathes beneath the floorboards, a presence felt not in whispers, but in denial, because no one wants to speak about what her tomb really is. They call her the Virgin Queen, the last Tudor, the mother of her people. But under Westminster Abbey, in a sealed vault few now dare to open, lies a riddle without resolution, a monarch who, even in death, refused to surrender the stage. Her image still adorns stained glass, her words are still quoted, her face, impossible and frozen, still stares from oil portraits, impossibly pale, lips stained red as rose petals, neck elongated like a candle flame, eternal, untouchable. But that face is a lie. We know that now. We know what lay behind the cosmetics, what fused in the tomb, what hissed when the lid split open. And we also know why no one dares speak of it. Because if you admit what she became, you must admit what she always was, not divine, not perfect, not beyond the reach of decay, just a woman. And if she was only a woman, then what is monarchy? What is history when stripped of its perfume? What is reverence when its object has melted into rot? You can still walk the halls above her. The stones are cold and polished. The candles flicker. The abbey choir echoes with grandeur. Her tomb is marked with respect, etched with titles, Queen of England and Ireland, Defender of the Faith. But no one kneels beside it. No one lingers, because something in that vault resists prayer. There are accounts, quiet ones, of those who have worked below the abbey, who have passed the sealed door late at night, and felt a kind of pressure, a humidity, an unease, nothing they could explain, just a sense of being watched, not by eyes, but by intention, as though something beneath the stone has not finished speaking. And maybe it hasn't. Maybe Elizabeth's final message was never delivered in life. Maybe her legacy is not in speeches or marble, but in the terrible truth of what her body became. Because what lies in that casket is not a corpse, it is evidence. Evidence that no matter how beautifully you rule, no matter how fiercely you cling to power, time will come for the flesh. It will melt the wax, it will split the seams, it will blacken the silk and bubble the blood and crack the gold. And yet, even in this, she wins, because her body, unnatural and unrotted, refuses to be forgotten. It endures, and in doing so, it traps us all. We are still living in the long shadow of her refusal to yield, to lie still, to be just one thing. In every royal myth that denies the human, in every power that hides its fear of aging, its terror of being seen, we find her again. Her myth still rules, but now we know what it's made of: wax, lead, rot, smoke, and silence. And beneath all of that, beneath the perfumes and titles and state ceremonies, something beats, slowly, like a second heart, not human, not divine, but something in between, something buried, but not dead. You might think that rot ends with burial, that once the stone is sealed, the horror is over. But Elizabeth's decay didn't stop at the skin, it entered the bloodstream of history itself. There is a particular violence in the way empires remember their queens. They sculpt them from contradiction. They strip the body, rebuild the image, and call it reverence. Elizabeth I was the first modern monarch to master this process in life, but in death, Her legacy was taken up by others, and twisted again and again into a shape that could be passed down, displayed, and consumed. She became a relic, a weapon, a mirror, and most dangerously, a precedent. After her burial, and long after her mythosified into Gloriana, the real Elizabeth began to vanish from record, replaced by story. She became a case study for power through chastity, for sovereignty without softness, for rule without reproduction. Kings envied her image, queens feared her shadow, and the people, the ones who never saw her face unpainted, remembered her as the woman who never bled, never aged, never surrendered. Even if that memory was false, especially because it was false. Because false memory is useful, the Victorians raised statues in her image. Historians canonized her political brilliance, but rarely addressed the brutality beneath it. Her virginity was transformed into a form of national purity, the body politic itself, sealed and sterile, immune to foreign invasion and internal weakness. But that idea, like her embalmed body, was never stable. It fermented. Beneath the idealized surface, her memory began to leak. Artists, playwrights, poets, they returned to her, not to praise, but to unearth. They asked questions her courtiers would never dare. What did she fear in her own body? Why did she cling so violently to control? What did it cost to maintain a myth that never allowed her to be human? In plays, she was recast as lonely. In novels, as cruel. In private scholarship, she became a study in strategic femininity, a woman who turned gender into armor and authority into isolation. Some called it genius, others called it a prison. Either way, it worked. And so, she became more than a monarch. She became a template for the woman in power who must not weep, for the leader who must appear untouched by flesh, for the body politic rendered bodiless. But the irony remained, sealed under Westminster, a queen who denied her humanity in life, and whose remains in death proved nothing but humanity in its most graphic, disturbing form. She could control her image, she could control her voice, but she could not control what her body became. And we are still haunted by that contradiction, because even now, or centuries later, we try to preserve the illusion. We speak of her as monarch, virgin, savior. We trace her speeches, hang her portrait, dramatize her court, but few dare imagine her as she truly ended, alone, afraid, refusing to lie down, and then, long after silence claimed her, decomposing in secret, not peacefully, but chemically, explosively, violently, because that is what happens to myths when they are denied the dignity of truth. They rupture, and the rupture never fully heals. You can still hear her today, though not in voice. She speaks through marble and glass, through velvet uniforms and antique law, through every official who performs their role not as a person, but as a function, inherited from a corpse who once refused to lie down. Her story has become architecture, cold, clean, ceremonial, but none of it tells you what she became. Her throne has been polished, her image enshrined, her mistakes excused, her body erased. Only one thing was left intact, and no one speaks of it: the coffin, still sealed, still underfoot, still hissing in the dark, a relic no one venerates. Because to look inside again would be to see everything monarchy fears about itself. Because here is the truth no sovereign dares confess. Every throne is built on a body that cannot rest. Every symbol must be hidden from what it came from: blood, heat, gas, and silence. Elizabeth's body did not quietly return to the soil. It refused decomposition. It became volatile. A queen who ruled by controlling the visual now lies in a box, too unstable to open. And yet we do open her, again and again. Not with shovels, with stories. Every time we make a film, mount a play, dramatize her reign, we are lifting the lid again, hoping it will be different this time, hoping her corpse will look clean, hoping the gases have cooled, that the heart has turned to pearl. But the coffin always opens the same way: a hiss, a rush of heat, and the slow, sick recognition that we still don't know how to bury her. Not truly, Because what do you bury when the myth is still feeding on us? When the Queen is long gone, but her contradictions still walk through governments, still echo through parliaments, still twist inside every courtroom where power pretends to be sacred. She was the first to understand it, to live the illusion fully. But we inherited the smell. Her image sold the lie that power, properly painted, could be eternal. But her coffin told the truth. Nothing inside the body obeys, not even for a queen. And now her decomposition is ours. It clings to the idea that leadership must never show weakness. It clings to the pressure on women in power to be perfect or monstrous, never human. It clings to the bones of a nation that still pretends its monarchs glow, when in fact they ferment on what of the heart, the final, inescapable centerpiece, not buried with her, not burned, not returned to dust, but sealed, hardened, transmuted. When the tomb was opened, centuries later, it was this heart that disturbed the observers most, not because it was grotesque, but because it had survived. No longer a heart, but a stone, not just metaphor, not just poetry, a literal mineral mass, hardened by resin, darkened by decay, glowing faintly under the lamplight like something that should not be. One scholar, upon seeing it, is said to have turned away and whispered, "This is not death, this is refusal." And he was right. Elizabeth's story does not end. It hardens. The heart that refused to decay, that stone organ sealed in salts and silence, remains the most disturbing detail of all. For centuries, it was little more than a footnote in obscure records, an object no one wanted to display, too strange for reverence, too intimate for science. And yet, it survived, not through preservation, through defiance. No body is supposed to do that. No organ is meant to resist time so completely. But hers did, hardened, compressed, as if everything she couldn't say in life, every buried feeling, every withheld confession, had crystallized into one single mass. Not heart, not muscle, not soul. A monarch's refusal, fossilized. And even now, scholars don't know what to do with it. They do not discuss it in public lectures. They do not exhibit it in royal museums. But the record is there, in a dusty archive, beneath the Abbey's administration offices, a note describing its weight, its color, its unnatural density. Dark gray, smooth-edged, heavier than expected. Not soft, not pliable. Refused dissection. Refused, like her, because there is a point at which memory resists history, and Elizabeth's heart, literal or not, became that resistance, a thing that outlasted language. But the heart is only a symbol. The real transformation, the one no embalmer, no scholar, no royal commission could contain, was what she became to those who followed. She was not just England's queen. She became England's anxiety, its fear of disorder, its need for control, its terror of female power unbound. And so the corpse was hidden, the rot suppressed. The real story, the one we've unearthed here, was never told. Because to tell it would be to admit what the monarchy itself cannot bear to say. That power is a costume, that the crown is a mask, that beneath it all, there is always a body. And bodies break, they leak, they stink, they burst under pressure. They become something inconvenient, just like hers did. So the vault stayed sealed. The legends flourished. Her face, so carefully reconstructed in life, returned in every painting, every textbook, every ceremonial reenactment. She became untouchable again, but never truly, because something still waits below Westminster, not her soul, not her spirit, just the weight of a history that refused to decompose, a pressure that still hums in the stone, a hiss. If you listen closely enough, there's a reason they never touched her again. After the coffin hissed, after the scholars recoiled, the notes grew sparse, and the documents became hesitant, fragmented. There were no second attempts, no careful rebalancing of her corpse, no cleaning of the chamber, no ceremony, just silence, just distance, because they knew they had come too close to the core, not the heart, not the skull, not the ancient robes stained by liquefied flesh. They had come too close to the truth. that Elizabeth was not just buried beneath the abbey, she was buried beneath everything. Beneath the monarchy, beneath the myths we write to hide from death, beneath every story that tries to make a woman's body into a symbol. As long as it never leaks, never groans, never crumbles into something real. And now that truth lives on, not in her vault, in us. Every time we speak of her, we make a choice. Do we honor the mask, or do we listen for the hiss? Because her story is not over. It lingers in the institutions that still borrow her silence, in the museums that paint her face without her ruin, in the crowns worn by those who still pretend that lineage means permanence, and sometimes, on quiet mornings, in the abbey above her, a strange humidity hangs in the air. They say it's the old stone, the ancient mortar, but some, the ones who've worked there long, claim they've felt it. A presence, a pressure, a warmth, a natural and low, just near her grave. They never speak of it officially, but they know. They don't touch the vault. They don't whisper near it. They walk faster past that corner of the abbey, because if you slow down, if you linger too long in that airless pocket of ancient stone, you might begin to hear it. The hiss, the pressure, the slow reminder that power, no matter how sacred it pretends to be, always ends in the dark. And sometimes it doesn't end at all. Sometimes it just waits.